The sound of glass shattering against the cold marble of the courtroom was like a gunshot, freezing time on that Thursday morning. Emma's small body, just 10 years old, slipped from the wooden chair like a leaf falling in autumn, while her mother Sarah watched the scene in slow motion, powerless to stop the inevitable. The microphone toppled along with the water jug, creating a chaotic symphony that reverberated through courtroom 302 of the municipal courthouse. For a moment no one moved. Judge Thompson, known for his unyielding severity, remained motionless in his elevated seat, his eyes fixed on the fallen child. The bailiff, the court reporter, even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. In that suspended instant, the last 72 hours of Sarah Peterson's life paraded before her eyes like a cruel film. 72 hours. That was how long it had been since she and Emma had turned their old Chevrolet into an improvised home. 3 days since the landlord, with an eviction notice in one hand and false apologies in the other, had forced them to leave the small apartment they called home. 3 nights spent in different parking lots, trying to keep alive the illusion of normalcy for a little girl who deserved far more than life was offering at that moment. "Emma?" Sarah cried, finally breaking the spell that had kept everyone paralyzed. She threw herself to the floor, ignoring the broken glass, her knees protesting against the impact with the cold marble. Her hands trembled as they touched her daughter's face, searching for signs of injury. Judge Thompson stood, his black robe swirling like dark wings. "Someone call for medical assistance," his authoritative voice cut through the air. But before anyone could move, Emma slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the fluorescent lights overhead. "I'm sorry, Mommy," she whispered, her small voice heavy with shame. "I tried to stay awake." The girl's words hit the courtroom like an involuntary confession. Sarah pulled her daughter closer, feeling the small, tired body tremble in her arms. How had they gotten to this point? The answer was folded in her pocket. A $400 parking ticket, a piece of paper that weighed more than lead in her already shattered life. 3 weeks ago, Sarah was still a nurse's assistant at the municipal hospital, part of a respected team, with a modest but sufficient salary to keep a roof over their heads. Then came the cuts. Restructuring, they called it. A cruel euphemism for destroying lives. She was one of the first to go, along with other younger staff. No warning, no time to prepare. Just a formal handshake and a letter of recommendation that didn't pay the bills. Desperation led her to that fateful job interview 2 weeks ago. A private clinic on the other side of town, an opportunity that seemed promising. 12 hours. That's how long she had been parked in that no-parking zone, first waiting for the interview that was always just a few minutes away, then begging for a chance, any chance. When she finally returned to the car, she found the ticket under the windshield wiper, a $400 sentence she had no way of paying. "Miss Peterson." Judge Thompson's voice pulled her back to the present. He had descended from his seat and was now kneeling beside them, his eyes no longer cold but curious. "Are you all right? Is your daughter all right?" Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. How could she answer that question when nothing in her life was all right? How could she admit, in this room full of strangers, that her daughter had fainted from exhaustion because sleeping in the back seat of a car didn't provide the rest the child needed? "I'm really tired, Your Honor," Emma replied before her mother could stop her. Her green eyes, so much like her mother's, met the judge's with disarming honesty. "The car seat is too hard to sleep in, and sometimes I stay awake listening to Mommy cry when she thinks I'm sleeping." The silence that followed those words was deafening. Sarah felt her face burn with shame, but she couldn't deny the truth in her daughter's words. The past few days had been an exercise in pretending everything was fine, pretending sleeping in the car was an adventure, pretending that her nightly tears were just the wind blowing through the cracks in the windows. Judge Thompson stood slowly, his face a mask of contemplation. Behind his gold-framed glasses, something had changed. The man known for his unyielding rigidity seemed to be looking beyond case number 47 on his docket, beyond the mere traffic violation. "Miss Peterson," he began, his voice carrying a different tone now, "I think we need to talk. Not about a parking ticket, but about something much more important." A court officer approached with a clean glass of water for Emma, while another quickly swept up the shards of glass from the floor. Sarah helped her daughter sit back down, noticing how she could barely keep her eyes open. The weight of sleepless nights, the shame of her situation, the fear of the future, all of it threatened to crush her. But something was changing in that courtroom. The heavy air of judgment had transformed into something else, something Sarah didn't dare call hope. Still, she could feel it, fragile as the first light of dawn, starting to pierce through the cracks of her darkness. Judge Thompson removed his glasses, methodically cleaning them with a white handkerchief, a gesture that seemed more like a pause to organize his thoughts than an actual need. When he put them back on, his eyes met Sarah's with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "Emma," Judge Thompson spoke softly, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised even his oldest staff members, "would you like some hot chocolate?" "Margaret," he turned to his assistant, a gray-haired woman who was watching the scene with tear-filled eyes, "could you get that for our young guest?" The girl looked to her mother, seeking permission, and Sarah nodded slightly, still stunned by the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. The moment seemed suspended in the air, as if time itself was hesitant to move forward. As Margaret hurried to fulfill the judge's unusual request, Thompson removed his robe with a deliberate motion, the heavy fabric sliding from his shoulders as if it carried the weight of formal authority with it. The transformation was striking. Without the garment that symbolized his judicial power, a different man emerged, not the austere figure presiding over the court, but someone whose eyes revealed a deep understanding born of his own experiences. His simple suit and slightly loosened tie spoke of a humanity that the robe had once concealed. "You know, Emma," he continued, pulling his chair closer, the soft scrape of metal feet against marble echoing through the quiet room, "when my daughter was your age, she also used to sleep in strange places." The way his brows furrowed slightly as he recalled the memory suggested it still carried its weight. "After her mother left us, I spent months working double shifts as a waiter, trying to keep our home. Catherine, my daughter, often fell asleep on the restaurant benches, waiting for my shift to end." The silence that followed his words was heavy with meaning. Sarah watched, fascinated, as the judge's stern face softened, the lines of worry on his brow giving way to an expression of shared understanding. It was as if an invisible mask had fallen, revealing not just the man behind the title, but also his own battles and scars. "What happened to her, sir?" Emma asked, her voice small but curious, her eyes fighting against the sleep that still clung to her. "Today she's a doctor," he replied with a smile that lit up his entire face, transforming his features in a way Sarah had never imagined possible. "But the path wasn't easy. We needed help, a lot of help. And I took too long to accept that." He paused meaningfully, his eyes meeting Sarah's with an intensity that made her hold her breath. "Sometimes our greatest obstacle is our own pride." At that moment, Margaret returned, bringing not just the promised hot chocolate, but also a package of cookies which she discreetly placed beside the cup. The sweet, comforting aroma of the chocolate filled the air, bringing with it a sense of normalcy that had long seemed lost to Sarah and Emma. The girl wrapped her small hands around the warm cup, as if that simple gesture could anchor this moment of unexpected comfort. Sarah noticed how her daughter's fingers trembled slightly, not from fear this time, but from the exhaustion that had built up after nights spent sleeping in the back seat of the car. "Mrs. Peterson," the judge turned to Sarah, his professional tone now blended with genuine concern, "tell me about your work at the hospital." For a moment, Sarah hesitated. The words seemed caught in her throat, as if she feared that by giving voice to her story, the pain would become even more real. But there was something in Judge Thompson's gaze, a silent understanding, that encouraged her to begin. The words started to flow, first hesitantly like a shy stream, but soon they turned into a current of memories and emotions. Sarah spoke about the 6 years she had dedicated to nursing, about the love she felt for her work and for the patients she helped. She described the extra nights she worked voluntarily, not just for the extra money that would ensure Emma had school supplies, but because she truly believed in the difference she could make in people's lives. Her voice trembled as she recalled the fateful day she was called to the Human Resources office. The coffee was still warm on her desk when she received the news. "Departmental restructuring," they said, as though those words could soften the blow of her termination. Sarah described how she had to keep a smile on her face as she emptied her workstation, the photos of Emma being the last thing she packed into the box, knowing that her daughter was waiting for her at school, unaware of how their lives were about to change. "The hardest part," she continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "wasn't losing the job. It was losing the ability to promise my daughter that everything would be okay. Because for the first time, I wasn't sure if it would be true." Emma, who had remained silent throughout her mother's recounting, reached out and intertwined her fingers with hers, a gesture of support that made Sarah's heart tighten. How could her little girl be so strong when she herself felt like she was falling apart? 15 years in court, Judge Thompson remarked, his voice heavy with reflection, "and sometimes I wonder if we lose ourselves amidst so many cases and regulations." He stood up, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the room as he walked to his desk. "We see so many cases, so many numbers, that we sometimes forget that behind every case is a human story, a lifetime of hopes and struggles." Taking the file related to Sarah's case, he examined it for a moment, as if looking beyond the words printed on the paper. With a deliberate movement, he pressed a stamp onto the document. The sound of the impact reverberated through the room like a final period in a difficult chapter. "The fine is waived, Mrs. Peterson," he declared, "but this is just the beginning." Sarah felt a momentary relief wash over her body, soon replaced by a new wave of anxiety. What more was to come? The judge seemed to sense her apprehension, as his next move was to reach for a business card from his drawer. "Catherine, my daughter, works at the St. Joseph's Medical Center. They are expanding the pediatric wing and urgently need experienced nurses." He extended the card to Sarah, the thin paper trembling slightly between his fingers. "I mentioned your case to her last night when I was reviewing today's cases. She was particularly interested in your experience with intensive care." Sarah took the card with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the gold letters printed on the textured paper. "Dr. Catherine Thompson, head of pediatrics." The possibility of a new beginning seemed to materialize in that small rectangle of paper. "But that's not all," the judge continued, his gaze now turning to a different file on his desk. "Margaret, please bring the housing assistance package." The assistant quickly returned with a thick folder, which the judge began to flip through with purpose. Each page turn sounded like a new possibility being revealed. "There is a temporary housing program for healthcare professionals in transition. Furnished apartments, subsidized by the hospital, designated for staff in emergency situations." He slid a form across the desk. "Normally there's a waiting list, but Catherine assured me we can expedite your case, given the circumstances." Emma, who had remained extraordinarily quiet throughout the conversation, let out a small sigh of contentment. The hot chocolate had left a brown mustache on her upper lip, and for the first time in days, her eyes sparkled with something more than exhaustion. It was as if the mere mention of a real home had returned a bit of the innocence that the past days had stolen. "But why?" Sarah finally managed to ask, her voice choked with emotion. "You don't even know me." Judge Thompson smiled, a genuine smile that completely transformed his stern expression. "You know, Mrs. Peterson, sometimes we need to be reminded that the law exists to protect people, not to punish them. Your daughter," he gestured toward Emma, who was now struggling to keep her eyes open, comforted by the warmth of the drink, "did me a favor today." He stood up again, this time heading to the window of his office. The morning sun was now high, casting long shadows across the marble floor, creating a pattern that seemed to dance with the promise of a new day. "When Catherine was little," he continued, his voice soft, carrying the weight of memories, "she also had the habit of telling inconvenient truths at inopportune moments. It was she who made me realize I needed help, that I couldn't do everything alone." He turned to face Sarah, his eyes shining with a mixture of emotion and determination. "Today she saves lives and I try to do what I can from here." Margaret discreetly placed a handkerchief on the table near Sarah, who only then noticed the silent tears running down her face. Emma had finally surrendered to sleep, her head resting gently on the arm of the chair, the empty cup of hot chocolate still held tightly in her hands. Her face, for the first time in days, showed an expression of true peace. Dr. Catherine Thompson's office was a reflection of her personality, warm and professional at the same time. Photographs of smiling children adorned one wall, while diplomas and certificates discreetly occupied another. Sarah sat in the chair across from the mahogany desk, her hand still gripping the business card Judge Thompson had given her the day before. Emma had stayed at the hospital's new daycare, a colorful and safe space that made her eyes sparkle for the first time in weeks. "It's like a giant dollhouse, Mommy," she exclaimed upon seeing the little play kitchen and shelves full of children's books. Sarah could hardly hold back her tears as she watched her daughter being so warmly welcomed by the staff. "So you're Sarah?" Dr. Thompson's soft voice brought her back to the present. The resemblance to her father was striking, the same gentle eyes, though hers carried a honeyed tone that made them even warmer. "My father told me a lot about you and Emma." Catherine Thompson wasn't just the head of pediatrics, she was living proof that stories could have different endings. Her youthful face carried the determination of someone who had known adversity intimately and chose to turn it into strength. "You know," Catherine continued, leaning back in her chair, "when my father called me last night, I could hear something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. A kind of urgency mixed with hope." She opened a folder on her desk and Sarah recognized her resume, the same one she had handed in during that fateful job interview 2 weeks ago. "Your experience in intensive care is impressive, Sarah. But what really caught my attention was what isn't written here." Sarah felt her heart race. "What do you mean?" The voluntary overtime, the work with underprivileged families, the way you managed to raise your daughter alone while building a career. Catherine smiled, a smile that reached her eyes. My father always says that we can see a person's character not by what they do when everyone's watching, but by what they choose to do when no one is. The silence that followed was filled only by the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of children's laughter coming from the hospital's playground. Sarah thought of Emma, how her daughter had inadvertently changed the course of their lives with her innocent honesty. When I was Emma's age, Catherine began, rising to pour water into 2 glasses, I used to sleep on the benches of the restaurant where my father worked. I remember the smell of coffee and the sound of silverware clinking. I also remember the shame I felt when my classmates discovered that we lived in a tiny apartment at the back of the restaurant. She offered a glass to Sarah before continuing. But you know what I remember the most? The day my father finally accepted help. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. And now here I am trying to give back some of what I received. Sarah sipped the water, trying to control the emotion that threatened to spill over. The past 24 hours felt like a dream she feared she might wake from at any moment. The hospital is expanding our pediatric wing, Catherine continued, her voice now taking on a more professional tone. We need nurses who understand not just the technical aspect but who truly comprehend what it means to care for a family in crisis. Someone who's been on the other side of the line. She slid a contract across the desk. It's a full-time position with full benefits including health insurance for you and Emma. The salary is competitive and there's room for growth. Catherine paused, her eyes meeting Sarah's. But more than that, it's a chance to start over. The words danced before Sarah's eyes, scrambled by the tears she could no longer hold back. 6 months of an initial contract with the possibility of permanent employment. Dental plan. Life insurance. Meal vouchers. Every line of the contract felt like a brick rebuilding the future she thought she had lost. And there's one more thing, Catherine added, picking up another folder. The hospital's temporary housing program. We have a furnished apartment available in the residential complex nearby. 2 bedrooms, fully equipped kitchen, and a leisure area with a playground. She smiled again. Emma will love the heated pool. Sarah wanted to speak, to thank her, but the words seemed inadequate in light of the magnitude of the moment. How do you express gratitude when someone not only offers a job but also restores your dignity? I know what you're thinking, Catherine said softly. That it all sounds too good to be true. That there must be a catch. But you know, Sarah, sometimes life surprises us not with obstacles but with bridges. People who show up at just the right moment, ready to lend a hand. Like my father always says, true justice isn't in the law books, but in the small acts of compassion that change the course of a life. A sound of clear laughter came through the window, Emma playing on the playground with other children. Sarah watched her through the glass, her heart swelling as she saw her daughter running freely, the weight of the world absent from her small shoulders. When can we move in? Sarah asked, her voice choked but steady. Today, Catherine replied simply. The apartment's ready. I had it cleaned and stocked the fridge as soon as my father called me yesterday. She hesitated for a moment before adding, I hope you don't mind, but I asked our social worker to buy some essentials, bedding, towels, school supplies for Emma. Tears streamed down Sarah's face freely. Why? She asked, echoing the same question she'd asked Judge Thompson the day before. Why do all this for us? Catherine stood up and walked over to the window watching the children play outside. Because someone did the same for me and my father a long time ago. And because, she turned to Sarah with a gentle smile, sometimes all we need is a chance. Just one chance to prove we can start over, that we can be more than our circumstances. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, creating a golden pattern on the office floor. Outside, Emma laughed, free and carefree, just as a 10-year-old child should be. And there, in that moment, Sarah felt something she had lost weeks ago. The certainty that, no matter how dark the night, the dawn would always bring with it the promise of a new day. The sound of keys jingling in the lock echoed down the silent hallway. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling slightly as she turned the doorknob. Emma squeezed her other hand, conveying a strength that seemed greater than her small fingers could hold. Together, they took a step into what would be their new home. The apartment was modest, but the golden light of the late afternoon pouring through the windows made it feel magical. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the scent of fresh flowers. A small bouquet of white daisies rested on the kitchen table, alongside a handwritten note from Dr. Catherine. Welcome to your new beginning. Emma let go of her mother's hand and ran off to explore the space, her light steps echoing on the newly polished wooden floor. Mom, her voice called from the smaller bedroom, there's a princess bed in here, Sarah followed the sound of her daughter's joy, finding her jumping on a single bed decorated with a pale pink quilt and colorful pillows. The walls of the room had been painted a soft lavender, and a small white desk sat in the corner by the window. On it, new school supplies were neatly organized: notebooks, colored pencils, a purple backpack Emma had always admired in the shop window near her old school. Sarah leaned against the doorframe, watching her daughter explore every detail of the room with an enthusiasm she hadn't seen in a long time. Her eyes traced the shelves already filled with children's books, the small moon-shaped lamp, the fluffy rug that seemed to invite bare feet. Each element had been chosen with care, speaking of deep understanding, of genuine empathy. "Look, Mommy!" Emma exclaimed, opening the wardrobe. Inside, a few new pieces of clothing hung from the hangers: simple yet beautiful dresses, a warm coat for the approaching winter, soft pajamas decorated with stars and moons. On the closet floor, a pair of new white sneakers waited to replace the old ones, already worn out and tight. The tears Sarah had been holding back began to fall silently. They weren't tears of sadness or shame, like the ones she had shed so many nights in the car seat. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of hope reborn. "Why are you crying, Mommy?" Emma asked, coming closer with concern in her green eyes. "Don't you like our new house?" Sarah knelt down, hugging her daughter tightly. "They're tears of happiness, my love. Very much happiness." A soft knock on the door interrupted them. When Sarah opened it, she found a middle-aged woman with a kind smile on her lips. "Hello. I'm Rose, I live in the apartment next door. Catherine asked me to stop by and see if you need anything." Rose didn't come empty-handed. She brought a covered dish that gave off a delicious aroma of homemade lasagna. "I thought you might be hungry after such a busy day," she explained, walking into the kitchen with the familiarity of someone who already knew the space. As Rose set the table for dinner, she shared that she was also a nurse at the hospital, working in the pediatric ward for over 20 years. "Catherine is a blessing for that place," she said, serving generous portions of the steaming lasagna. "She's completely transformed the environment since she took over. She understands that a hospital isn't just about medical procedures, but about people caring for people." Emma, who had timidly sat at the table, took her first bite and her eyes lit up. "It's just like the lasagna Grandma used to make," she exclaimed, referring to her maternal grandmother who had passed away 3 years ago. Rose smiled, her eyes sparkling with genuine satisfaction. "You know, sweetheart, sometimes God puts angels in our path when we need them most. Some wear black robes, others white coats, and some—" she winked at Emma, "some make lasagna." As they shared that first meal in their new home, Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. The knot of worry she had carried for so long began to loosen, giving way to a long-forgotten feeling: belonging. Night gently fell over the residential complex. From the living room window, Sarah could see the lights of the hospital in the distance, where in a few days she would begin her new job. Emma had already fallen asleep in her new bed, hugging a stuffed rabbit she had found on her pillow, another thoughtful gift from Catherine. A message notification on her phone caught her attention. It was a photo sent by Dr. Thompson, an old picture showing a little girl asleep on a restaurant bench, a basic medical textbook open in her lap. The caption simply read, "Dreams begin in the most unlikely places. Rest well, tomorrow is a new day." Sarah walked to Emma's room, watching her daughter sleep peacefully. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting soft patterns on the girl's face. How different it was from the tense expression she had carried during the nights in the car. Now, in her sleep, there was peace, there was security. Back in the living room, Sarah allowed herself to sit on the soft couch, absorbing the welcoming silence of the apartment. Her eyes wandered over the details she hadn't noticed before: the small bookshelf with a few carefully selected books, including an updated pediatric nursing manual, the basket of basic cleaning products in the laundry cabinet, the calendar already hanging on the kitchen wall with the start of her job marked in red. Each detail spoke of careful planning, of people who cared enough to think beyond the obvious. It wasn't just about providing a roof or a job, it was about restoring dignity, rebuilding trust, reigniting hope. The phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Judge Thompson himself. "I just spoke with Catherine. Happy to hear you and Emma are settled. Remember, sometimes accepting help is an act of courage as great as offering it." Sarah closed her eyes, allowing the tears of gratitude to flow freely. In less than 48 hours, her life had made a complete turn. From the deepest despair to the truest hope. From the loneliness of the backseat of a car to the warmth of a real home. From the room, she could hear Emma's soft breathing, a sound that now brought peace instead of worry. Tomorrow would be a new day, yes. A day to start over, to rebuild, to believe once again that miracles happen in the most unlikely places and in the most unexpected forms. And as sleep finally enveloped her, comfortably settled in her new bed, Sarah understood that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as challenges, and that true justice doesn't lie in the codes of law but in the hearts of those who choose to look beyond appearances, those who choose to extend a hand when it would be easier to simply turn away. Her last thought before falling asleep was a silent prayer of gratitude, not just for the roof over her head or the job that awaited her, but for the precious reminder that even in the darkest nights, there is always the possibility of a new dawn. Sarah's first week in the pediatric ward of the hospital turned out to be a journey of discoveries that went beyond her professional duties. In every hallway, in every room, she found pieces of a bigger story than her own. The walls, painted with colorful murals of smiling animals, held the stories of countless families who, like her, had known both darkness and light. On a particularly busy morning, while checking the vital signs of a young patient, Sarah noticed a framed photograph at the nursing station. The image showed a young Catherine Thompson, not much older than Emma, asleep over medical books on a restaurant bench. Beside her, a younger man, whom Sarah recognized as Judge Thompson, was serving tables, his face marked with fatigue, but his eyes shining with determination. "That photo is my most precious treasure," Catherine's voice came softly from behind her. It was taken by one of the regular customers at the restaurant. He was a photographer and said he needed to capture that moment. A girl dreaming of medicine while her father fought to keep her dreams alive. Sarah watched as Catherine gently touched the photograph, her fingers tracing the image with reverence. "Back then," she continued, "I didn't fully understand the sacrifice my father was making. I just knew that, no matter how tired or hungry we were, he always found a way to buy me my school books." The silence that followed was filled only by the distant beeping of heart monitors and the soft murmurs of conversations in the hallways. Catherine smiled, a smile that carried both sweet and bitter memories. "You know what changed our life?" she asked, guiding Sarah to her office. A regular customer at the restaurant, Dr. Claire Mitchell. She was the head of pediatrics here at the hospital. Catherine opened a drawer in her desk, pulling out a yellowed letter. She noticed my interest in medicine and started bringing me used books. But more importantly, she saw through my father's pride. Sarah sat down, absorbing every word as Catherine continued her story. One day she offered him not charity but a partnership. She proposed that he manage the hospital cafeteria, a job that paid better and would allow him to be more present in my life. But the real change came when she convinced him to accept help from the hospital's educational assistance program for employees. "Is that why you created the housing program?" Sarah asked softly. "Exactly," Catherine smiled. "Claire taught me that sometimes we need to be the bridge that others need to cross through their toughest times." She passed away 5 years ago, but her legacy lives on in every family we help. At that moment, a nurse knocked on the door, bringing Emma by the hand. The little girl had just finished school and now spent her afternoons at the hospital's daycare, where she made friends with other children who, like her, were part of the hospital's big family. "Mommy?" Emma exclaimed, her eyes shining with excitement. "Mrs. Rose taught me how to make cookies today. And she told me about when she used to live in our building a long time ago when she lost everything in a fire." Catherine exchanged a meaningful glance with Sarah. Rose was more than a helpful neighbor. She was a living example of the cycle of care and compassion that characterized their community. 20 years earlier, she too had been helped by the housing program when a fire destroyed everything she owned. Now she spent her free time helping other families rebuild their lives. "Emma," Catherine called gently, "how about you show your mom the picture you drew today? It's hanging on the daycare's mural." As Emma pulled Sarah down the hall, Catherine watched them walk away, her heart filled with a satisfaction that went beyond professional pride. In just 1 week, she had witnessed a remarkable transformation in both of them. Sarah no longer carried that scared, cornered look, and Emma radiated a joy that only a truly secure child can display. On the daycare mural, among dozens of other colorful drawings, was Emma's creation, a simple yet touching representation of her new life. On the paper, she had drawn what she called her heart family. Sarah, of course, but also Judge Thompson, Catherine, Rose, and several others who had crossed her path in the past few weeks. Above the drawing, in colorful letters, it read, "Sometimes angels don't have wings, they wear white coats and make lasagna." Sarah felt tears begin to form, but this time she didn't try to hold them back. They were different tears now, not tears of despair or shame but of gratitude and hope. Emma had captured in her childlike drawing a profound truth, that sometimes families aren't just made of blood ties, but of invisible chains of compassion and understanding. That night, during dinner in her apartment, now truly a home, Sarah listened to Emma excitedly recount her day, the new friends she had made, how Mrs. Rose had promised to teach her how to make apple pie over the weekend. The scent of fresh flowers, now a weekly tradition started by Catherine, filled the air, blending with the comforting smell of homemade food. Later, after putting Emma to bed, Sarah found an envelope that someone had slipped under her door. Inside was an old photograph, Judge Thompson, much younger, sitting on a restaurant bench with Catherine asleep in his lap, a basic medical textbook still open in her small hands. On the back, a handwritten note. Sarah, when Catherine was little, I used to wonder if I was doing the right thing, if I should have accepted help sooner, if my pride was costing her too much. Today, seeing you and Emma flourish, I understand that sometimes we need to be broken in order to be rebuilt stronger. True strength is not in carrying our burdens alone, but in allowing others to help us carry them. Keep being an example of courage for your daughter, just as you have been for all of us. Judge Thompson. Sarah held the photograph against her chest, feeling the weight of the words and the lightness that comes with understanding. Somewhere in the hospital, Catherine was probably making her last rounds of the day. Next door, Rose was likely planning which recipes she would teach Emma over the weekend. And in his office, Judge Thompson might be looking at other cases, trying to see beyond the paperwork, seeking the human stories that needed not judgment but understanding. They all in some way were part of a larger tapestry, a fabric of compassion and hope that continued to grow, embracing new members, healing old wounds, building bridges over the chasms of adversity. And at the center of this web of connections, Sarah had finally found not just a place to call her own, but a fundamental truth, that sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the grand dramatic gestures, but the small daily acts of kindness that, like persistent drops of water, have the power to turn deserts into gardens. In the quiet of a Sunday afternoon, a month after her arrival at the hospital, Sarah found Catherine sitting alone in the hospital chapel. The colorful light from the stained glass windows danced across her white coat, creating a mosaic of colors that seemed to tell its own silent story. The air was filled with the gentle scent of fresh lilies and the distant echo of footsteps in the outer corridors. In her hands, Catherine held an old, yellowed photograph Sarah had never seen before, her fingers gently caressing the frayed edges with a reverence that spoke of deeply kept memories. Today marks 20 years, Catherine said softly without turning, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of memories. 20 years since Dr. Claire saved not just my life, but my soul. She gestured for Sarah to sit beside her on the polished wooden bench, the old piece of furniture creaking softly under her weight. The photograph Catherine extended showed a scene that made Sarah's heart tighten. A teenage Catherine in a hospital bed, pale and fragile, connected to a series of tubes and monitors blinking silently. Judge Thompson, much younger but with eyes aged by fear, held his daughter's hand with an intensity the photo captured perfectly. Beside the bed, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and kind eyes, Dr. Claire, monitored the vital signs with a focus that seemed to transcend professionalism. It was an overdose, Catherine revealed, her voice trembling with the vulnerability of the confession. The silence that followed her words was heavy with decades of pain not fully healed. I was 15 and I was tired. It wasn't just physical exhaustion, it was a weariness of the soul. Tired of being the poor girl, tired of seeing my father killing himself working 2, sometimes 3 jobs. Tired of carrying the weight of dreams that seemed so impossibly far away. Sarah watched as Catherine's hands trembled slightly while she continued her story. Back then, we lived in a tiny apartment behind the restaurant where my father worked. The walls were so thin I could hear every sigh of worry from him at night. He tried to hide the overdue bills, the collection letters, but I saw it all. I saw how he skipped meals so I could eat, how his clothes became more and more worn as he made sure I always had new school supplies. The sunlight shifted, now casting long shadows through the stained glass windows, painting the chapel floor with patterns that resembled broken pieces of a stained glass, not unlike the fragments of life Catherine was sharing. It was Dr. Claire who found me, she continued, her eyes fixed on a distant point, reliving that crucial moment. I had chosen the staff bathroom in the restaurant. I thought it would be more discreet. She was there, having coffee like she did every morning before her shift at the hospital. When she found me, Catherine closed her eyes, allowing a single tear to slip down her cheek. She didn't just call the ambulance, she stayed with me holding my hand, reminding me that I had worth, that my life mattered. In the midst of the chaos, her voice was like an anchor pulling me back to the surface. Sarah felt her own tears begin to fall, recognizing echoes of her own recent despair in the story. Catherine noticed and gently covered Sarah's hand with hers. But the real miracle, Catherine continued, her voice gaining strength, wasn't surviving that day. It was what happened afterward. Dr. Claire did something extraordinary, something that not only changed my life but the way I see the world. She turned my recovery into a mission. Catherine stood up and walked to the chapel window. The hospital garden stretched below, an oasis of green dotted with benches where patients and their families found moments of peace. She brought me into the hospital not just as a patient but as an apprentice. She started by giving me small tasks, organizing files, keeping lonely patients company. But more than that, she taught me that our scars aren't just marks of pain, they're maps that can guide others through their own storms. At that moment, the sound of children's laughter echoed down the hallway. Emma and other kids from the daycare passed in an orderly line, returning from an activity in the garden. Sarah watched her daughter, covered in paint and grinning from ear to ear, so different from the scared little girl who had slept in the backseat of the car just a month ago. "Your daughter reminds me so much of myself at that age," Catherine smiled, watching the children. "Before everything went wrong, of course. I had that sparkle in my eyes too, that ability to find joy in the smallest moments. That's what Dr. Claire helped to reignite in me, not just the will to live but the ability to dream again." Catherine sat back down, pulling another photograph from the pocket of her coat. This one more recent, showing her at her medical school graduation, Dr. Claire and Judge Thompson by her side, all with radiant smiles. "You know why I chose you, Sarah?" Catherine asked, her voice soft but firm. "Because I saw in your eyes the same thing Dr. Claire must have seen in mine. Not just pain or despair, but a strength you didn't even know you had. A capacity to transform your own pain into understanding and compassion for others." The silence that followed was filled with the kind of understanding that transcends words. Sarah thought about how her own story of despair had transformed into one of hope, how what seemed like her lowest point had become the catalyst for a profound change. "There's something else I need to show you," Catherine said, standing up and extending her hand to Sarah. They walked down the hospital corridors, their footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor, until they reached a room Sarah had never noticed before. On the door, a simple sign read, "Claire Mitchell Room Healing Circle." When Catherine opened the door, Sarah's breath caught. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, each one telling its own story of transformation. Families reunited after crises, children recovered from serious illnesses, healthcare professionals who had started as patients or needy relatives. "This is Dr. Claire's true legacy," Catherine explained, walking between the photographs. "Every person here has gone through their own valley of shadows, but found light through the compassion of others. And each of them in turn has become a light for someone else." Sarah stopped in front of a recent photograph, herself with Emma, on the day she began working at the hospital. Next to it, the old photo of Judge Thompson with Catherine in the restaurant. And between them, a photo of Dr. Claire, her eyes glowing with the same compassion Sarah now saw daily in Catherine's eyes. "Tomorrow," Catherine said softly, "a new family arrives in the housing program. A single mother with 2 young children, fleeing an abusive relationship. I thought you might be the perfect person to welcome them." Sarah felt something expand in her chest, a sense of purpose, of belonging to something larger than herself. "It would be an honor," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Dr. Claire always said that true healing happens in circles." Catherine smiled, gently touching Sarah's shoulder. "Those who have been healed become healers. Those who have received compassion learn to offer it. That's how we transform tragedy into triumph, despair into hope." At that moment, Emma ran into the room, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Mom, Mrs. Rose said we can make cookies for the new kids who are coming tomorrow. Can I help? Please?" Sarah exchanged a knowing glance with Catherine before responding, "Of course, sweetheart. That's how we build our bigger family, right? One cookie at a time, one smile at a time, one story at a time." As Emma bounced with joy, Sarah realized that her story, which had started with a parking ticket and a seemingly stern judge, was just one link in a much larger chain of transformation and healing. A chain that continued to grow, intertwining lives, building bridges over the chasms of loneliness and despair, weaving a tapestry of hope that stretched far beyond the walls of that hospital. As the late afternoon light streamed through the windows of the room, it turned the photographs on the walls into silent witnesses to countless journeys of healing. In the center of it all, Emma danced, her pure and contagious joy a living testament to the transformative power of compassion. And Sarah, watching her daughter, finally understood that sometimes the greatest miracles don't happen in grand dramatic gestures, but in the small daily choices to extend a hand to someone in need, to turn our own pain into understanding, to keep the flame of hope alive even in the darkest nights. 6 months had passed since that morning in court, and autumn was now painting the hospital garden in golden and rust-red hues. Sarah was organizing some files at the nurse's station when an unusual commotion caught her attention. Judge Thompson was walking down the pediatric hallway, no longer wearing his formal robe, but a simple suit and the warm smile that had become his trademark during his weekly visits to the hospital. In his arms he carried an old wooden box, the kind that holds family treasures and precious memories. Emma, who had been helping Mrs. Rose distribute snacks to the patients, ran to hug him, a ritual that had naturally developed over the months. "Grandpa Thompson," she exclaimed, making the judge laugh with the spontaneity of the title she had recently started using. "I have something special to show you all," he announced, heading toward the Claire Mitchell room, where Catherine was already waiting for them. Sarah noticed how her eyes were fixed on the box, a mix of curiosity and recognition in them. The room, already a sanctuary of healing stories, seemed even more sacred that autumn afternoon. The setting sun filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow that seemed to bless every photograph on the walls. Among them there were now new additions, including a recent photo of Sarah and Emma helping Jessica, the single mother of 2 children they had taken in months earlier, move into her own apartment after securing a stable job. Claire kept this, the judge began, placing the box on a central table. She started this tradition on the day she saved Catherine. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the lid, revealing dozens of letters, photographs, and small objects, each with its own story of transformation. "I found this while organizing some old documents," he continued, pulling out a yellowed envelope. The elegant handwriting on the envelope simply read, "For the future." Inside, there was a letter written by Dr. Claire shortly before her passing. Catherine, who had quietly approached, took the letter with reverence. Her voice cracked as she began to read. "Dear friends of the future. If you are reading this letter, it means that the circle of healing continues to grow. When I began this work, I had no idea how a small act of kindness could multiply into thousands of stories of transformation. It all started with a breakfast in a simple restaurant and a young girl who desperately needed someone to see her, to truly see her. Catherine taught me that sometimes our most important patients are those who are not on any medical chart. This hospital is not just a place for physical healing. It is a sanctuary where broken hearts find hope, where stories of despair are rewritten with compassion, where strangers become family. To those who will continue this work, always remember that every person who crosses through these doors carries a story that deserves to be heard. Sometimes the greatest act of healing is simply being present, listening with the heart, and extending a hand when everyone else has turned away. True medicine is not just in procedures and medications, but in the transformative power of a caring heart. Every act of kindness is a seed planted that will bloom into gardens we may never see. With eternal love, Claire Mitchell. The silence that followed the reading was thick with emotion. Sarah watched as silent tears ran down Catherine's face, while Judge Thompson held Emma's hand, who listened with a wisdom beyond her years. "There's more," the judge said softly, pulling a photo album from the box. On the yellowed pages, a young Dr. Claire smiled alongside countless patients and families. In one of the photos, she was in the same restaurant where she would later find Catherine, serving coffee to a group of homeless people. "She did this every morning before coming to the hospital," Catherine explained, her voice heavy with memories. "She'd buy coffee and bread for anyone in need. That's how she found me that day. She was doing what she always did, caring for others." Sarah felt Emma squeeze her hand. "Mommy," she whispered, "it's like what you and Aunt Catherine are doing now, isn't it? Helping other families just like we were helped." Emma's innocent question perfectly captured the essence of Claire's legacy. Sarah hugged her daughter, reflecting on how that morning in court, which had seemed like the end of all hope, had actually been just the beginning. "I have one more thing to share," Judge Thompson announced, pulling an official document from his folder. "The hospital board has unanimously approved it. Starting next month, our housing assistance program will officially be called the Claire Mitchell Transitional Housing and Family Support Program." Catherine covered her mouth with her hands, overwhelmed. "Dad, did you do this?" "No," he smiled, "we did this. All of us. Every person in this room, every photograph on these walls, every story of transformation. We are all part of Claire's legacy." Mrs. Rose, who had entered the room quietly, added her own story. "When I lost everything in the fire, Dr. Claire didn't just offer me a place to stay, she gave me back my dignity. She taught me that sometimes, we need to receive help to learn the best way to help others." Sarah thought about her own journey, from the shame of sleeping in a car with her daughter to the pride she now felt in being able to extend a hand to other families in need. Every small act of kindness she had received, she now multiplied through her own daily actions. "Do you know what else I found in the box?" the judge continued, pulling out one last item, a small metal plaque with an inscription. "Claire had this made just before she passed. I think now is the perfect time to put it up." Catherine read the inscription aloud, her words carrying the weight of the truth they held. "In this place, broken stories find healing, strangers become family, and the compassion of one multiplies into thousands." As the sun set outside, painting the sky in shades of hope, the small group gathered to hang the plaque. Emma insisted on helping, being lifted onto Judge Thompson's shoulders to reach the perfect spot above the door. "And so the circle continues," Catherine smiled, watching the scene. "Every story of healing becomes a seed for new transformations." Sarah looked around the room, to the photographs that told hundreds of stories of renewal, to her daughter now smiling with the carefree joy of childhood, to the people who had become her chosen family. She thought about how one simple act of compassion in a courtroom had triggered a wave of transformation that continued to expand. "For the future," she whispered, echoing the words from Claire's letter. "For the future," they all responded in unison, their voices blending into a promise of continuous hope. And outside, the sun had finally set, but inside that room, and in the hearts of all present, thousands of new suns were rising, each one lighting the way for someone still on their journey, seeking their own path back home. Dear viewers of the Life Stories channel, this story reminds us that the true magic of life happens in the small moments of human connection, in the daily choices to reach out to those in need, in the courage to accept help, and in the willingness to transform our own pain into light for others. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Share your own stories of transformation and hope in the comments below. Together, we can create a network of support and understanding that crosses boundaries and touches lives. Until the next story, where once again we will dive into the depths of the human heart, discovering the beauty that exists in every journey of transformation. With love, Life Stories.